Captain Elias Thorne gripped the rusted chain-link fence, his knuckles whitening against the red Martian dust that clung stubbornly to his gloves. The alien probe's high-pitched whine cut through the thin atmosphere like a scalpel, urging him to move faster. "Move now!" he barked, hauling Specialist Lena Voss over the perimeter with a grunt of effort. She landed in a crouch on the other side, her breath fogging the inside of her visor in quick, sharp bursts. Behind them, the outpost's emergency lights flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows across the cratered plain that stretched out like a scarred battlefield. Thorne risked a glance back. 3 figures in bulky environmental suits were sprinting from the Habdome, their movements exaggerated by the low gravity, bounding forward in eerie slow motion. "They're on us. Double time to the rover," he ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Private Jax Reed, the wiry engineer with a perpetual scowl etched on his face, vaulted the fence last, his toolkit banging painfully against his thigh with each impact. "That thing scanned us for hours," he cursed under his breath, falling into step beside Dr. Mira Kane, the xenobiologist whose calm, analytical eyes now darted nervously to the horizon. There, the probe hovered, its iridescent hull pulsing rhythmically like a living heartbeat, analyzing every detail it could glean. The group bolted towards the dust-streaked rover parked 100 meters out, their boots kicking up regolith and lazy floating arcs that hung in the air longer than they should. Thorne led the way, his marine training kicking in instinctively, turning each bound into efficient propulsion that propelled him forward with minimal waste. The probe descended lower, its emitters glowing brighter with malevolent intent, and a low hum began to vibrate through their bones. Mira had called it analysis mode during the prolonged siege. It had infiltrated the outpost systems weeks ago, methodically probing for physiological flaws, fragile human bones that cracked under pressure, inefficient lungs struggling in thin air, emotional volatility that could be exploited like a weak link in a chain. "Evac protocols," Thorne commanded, slamming his palm against the rover's access panel. The door hissed open reluctantly, but immediately alarms blared across the colony's network, a cacophony of warnings that echoed in their helmets. "It's locking us out," Jax growled, dropping to his knees and prying open a side panel with his multi-tool. Sparks flew in bright bursts as he bypassed the main relay, his hands moving with the precision of someone who'd jury-rigged systems under fire before. "Give me 30 seconds. Their tech's elegant, sure, but it's not built for this kind of desperation." Lena activated her wrist device, scanning the probe as data scrolled rapidly across her heads-up display. "It's adapting already," she reported, her voice tight. "Targeting our vitals. Heart rate spiking, adrenaline surge. They think we're predictable, like some equation they can solve." Mira knelt beside Jax, her voice remaining steady even as chaos closed in. "Predictable? That's their mistake. Humans don't break. We bend." She fed him a schematic from her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen with practice speed. The probe fired then, a containment beam lancing out like a shimmering net that singed the ground inches from Thorne's boot, leaving a blackened scar in the regolith. He drew his sidearm, a kinetic slugger, laughably primitive compared to the alien tech, and fired a burst of rounds. They pinged harmlessly off the probe's energy shield, but the distraction worked. The device veered off course, momentarily thrown. "Got it!" Jax yanked a wire free, and the rover's engine roared to life with a throaty growl. They piled inside, Thorne sliding into the driver's seat and gunning the accelerator. The vehicle lurched forward, its tires grinding over jagged rocks as the probe pursued relentlessly, its scans intensifying like a predator closing on wounded prey. But as they crested the crater rim, Thorne spotted the real threat. A swarm of drones lifting from a distant ridge, their sleek forms predatory and unyielding, thrusters whispering like distant thunder across the plain. The aliens weren't just analyzing anymore. They were coming to collect their specimens. Thorne slammed the accelerator to the floor, the engine howling in protest as they barreled down the crater's steep slope. Plumes of dust erupted behind them, but the swarm was already closing the gap, their advanced sensors locking onto the rover's heat signature with unerring precision. Jax gripped the dashboard, his eyes glued to the rear scanner. 15 incoming, minimum. They're vectoring straight on our heat signature. Options? Thorne barked, swerving sharply to avoid a jagged outcrop of rock. The rover fishtailed, its tires screeching against the loose regolith, threatening to spin out in the low gravity. Lena, wedged in the back with their salvaged gear, patched into the comms array, her voice steady but edged with the caution sharpened by surging adrenaline. Jamming won't hold, they're adaptive as hell. But that ridge ahead has magnetic interference from the old mining veins. If we hit it, we might shake their locks long enough to buy some distance. The first drone streaked overhead, its scan beam slicing through the air like a scalpel, missing them by a hair and carving a glowing trench in the dirt beside the rover. Thorne's knuckles whitened further on the wheel. Hold on. He veered hard left, aiming for the shadow of the ridge, the vehicle bucking violently over the uneven terrain and jolting every occupant. Jax twisted in his seat, pulling a jury-rigged EMP grenade from his pack, cobbled together from fragments of probe wreckage and the rover's spare batteries. This might clip a few of them, but it'll fry our nav systems too. Your call, Captain. Do it, Thorne said without a moment's hesitation. Out here, grit was their only edge. Hesitation was a death sentence. She lobbed the grenade out the side flap as they plunged into the ridge's lee, the device arcing gracefully before detonating in a crackling blue sphere that lit up the dust. 3 drones dropped like stones, sparking and inert as they hit the ground. But the rest scattered, recalibrating their formation in the magnetic haze. Their pursuit tightened, beams probing through the interference like searching fingers. Lena cursed under her breath, her fingers dancing over her tablet. Shields are fluctuating, the interference is buying us seconds, not minutes. A beam grazed the rover's flank then, melting a strip of armor in a hiss of superheated metal. Smoke billowed into the cab, acrid and hot, stinging their eyes through their visors. Thorne pushed the engine harder, the vehicle groaning in protest as they funneled into a narrow defile, rust-red rock walls looming close on either side. We need cover. That outpost ruin, half a click north. Can we make it? Jax scanned ahead, sweat beading on his brow beneath his helmet. Maybe, but they're predicting our path, look. On the display, the swarm reformed into a pincer formation, cutting off the northern route with ruthless efficiency. The rover shuddered as another beam struck, buckling the rear axle slightly. It held, but their speed dropped noticeably. Thorne's mind raced. Standard evasive maneuvers were straight out of the textbook, utterly predictable to these alien algorithms. Humans didn't play by their rules. Flip the script, he growled. Lena, vent the auxiliary coolant. Make us cold on their thermals. Jax rigged the exhaust to flare backward like a decoy burst. Lena paused for a split second, her cautious nature weighing the risks, then nodded, slamming open a panel and yanking the valves. A hiss of escaping vapor filled the air, chilling the cab instantly and fogging their visors further. Jax reversed the exhaust vents with makeshift wiring, sparks flying from the connections. The rover belched a plume of superheated gas behind them, perfectly mimicking their thermal signature. The drones veered into the fake trail without hesitation, their beams converging on the empty dust cloud. Thorne wrenched the wheel, cutting across the defile at a perpendicular angle, hugging the cold rock walls as closely as he dared. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. No scans, no pursuit hum vibrating through the hull. Then the drones realized the ruse, peeling back with furious acceleration, their thrusters flaring brighter. But by then, the outpost ruin loomed ahead, its crumbled dome a promise of temporary shelter. They skidded inside just as the first beams lanced through the entrance, collapsing rubble behind them in a deafening cascade. Thorne killed the engine, plunging them into a dim, echoing quiet broken only by their heavy breathing. Jax wiped the sweat from his face, grinning fiercely despite the burn mark searing his arm. That was too close. They learn fast, faster than I'd like. Lena sealed the inner hatch, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And we're leaking coolant. We can't run forever, not like this. Thorne reloaded his slugger with a metallic click, his eyes fixed on the blocked entrance where the drone's scans pulsed outside, probing relentlessly for any sign of weakness. Then we don't run. We hit back, find their hub, turn their analysis against them. The swarm hummed closer, but in the ruins' gloom the humans plotted their next move, their unbreakable resolve shining through the fear. Thorne crouched by the sealed hatch, his fingers tracing the faint, flickering glow of the outpost's emergency schematics on the cracked console. The air hummed with the distant whine of drones circling outside, their scans scraping against the rubble like invisible fingers testing for give. He jabbed a thumb at a shadowed corridor branching to the left. This way, old maintenance tunnels, might link to the surface vents. If we can loop around, we flank their swarm from the ridge. Jack snorted, binding his burned arm with a strip torn from his jacket. Flank? With what, our good looks? Those things adapt faster than we bleed. He tested the wrap, wincing but standing tall, his eyes sharp with that unyielding spark of determination. The burn's edges were blackened and raw, but he ignored it, already scanning for loose panels or weak points in the structure. Lena patched the coolant line with a makeshift clamp fashioned from scavenged wire, her hands steady despite the sweat beading on her brow. Cautious as ever, she glanced up from her work. Tunnels could be collapsed. One wrong turn and we're buried alive. But staying here's suicide. Their probes are mapping us already, piece by piece. Her voice held no panic, just the quiet weight of someone who'd calculated the odds 100 times over and chosen to fight anyway. The console beeped weakly then, a low alert cutting through the tension. Thorne pulled up the feed. Shadows of drones flitted across the blocked entrance, their beams slicing methodically through the stone, testing for breaches. One probe slipped through a narrow crack, its red optic pulsing as it hovered, analyzing the air for heat signatures and movement. "Company," he muttered, snapping his slugger to his shoulder. The shot cracked out sharply, shattering the drone into sparking fragments that rained against the wall like metallic confetti. Jax was already moving, prying open the corridor hatch with a grunt of effort. Dust billowed out in a choking cloud, revealing a narrow passage choked with debris but still passable if they moved carefully. "Lead or follow, pick fast." Her grin flashed again, defiant against the encroaching gloom. They slipped inside, Thorne first, the tunnel swallowing their footsteps in hollow echoes that seemed to mock their stealth. Lena brought up the rear, her scanner's faint light cutting swaths through the oppressive dark. The walls pressed close on all sides, etched with faded markings from the outpost's heyday. Remnants of human ingenuity carved into durasteel, now reduced to a forgotten vein in the Martian crust. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the air growing thicker and heavier, laced with the metallic tang of long-dormant machinery. A sudden rumble shook the floor beneath their boots, sending loose pebbles skittering. Thorne froze, raising a hand to halt them. Collapse ahead? But no, it was the drones breaching the main chamber behind them with calculated precision. Faint explosions rattled the tunnel walls and a new hum joined the chorus. Reinforcements burrowing parallel to their path, their drills whining like predators on the hunt. Jax cursed under his breath, checking his sidearm's charge indicator. "They're predicting us." That first swarm must have fed data back. Now they're tunneling like moles on steroids. Lena adjusted her scanner, the blue glow paling her face as she studied the readings. Worse. Scans show a nexus point up ahead in the central chamber. If that's their hub, it's coordinating the entire swarm. But it's guarded, multiple signatures converging on it right now. Thorne's jaw set firmly, the familiar weight of command settling over him like an old, worn cloak. No grand speeches or rallying cries, just the relentless grind of survival. Then we take it. Improvise a breach. Use your scanner for a decoy signal. Jax's fire for distraction. We hit hard. Overload the core. He met their eyes one by one, the plan raw and unpolished but forged in the fire of the moment. They pressed on, the tunnel widening gradually into a junction where rubble piled high on one side, but a service ladder climbed to a grated overlook above. Jax scaled it first, moving silent as a shadow despite his injury, then waved them up with a quick gesture. From the perch, the chamber sprawled below them, a cavernous ruin illuminated by the weaving patrols of drones threading through collapsed gantries and twisted metal. At the center, the hub pulsed with an otherworldly energy, a crystalline array of alien technology, its tendrils snaking into the walls like roots, analyzing every vibration and echo in the structure. One drone veered dangerously close, its scan beam brushing the edge of the grate, sending a shiver through the metal. Thorne held his breath, muscles tensed, but Jax's hand shot out, hurling a loose bolt that clanged loudly against the far wall. The drone banked away sharply, drawn to the noise like a moth to flame. Lena whispered urgently, "Signal ready. It'll mimic a power surge. Draw them to the east tunnel for 30 seconds, tops." Thorne nodded, his pulse steady. On my mark. The stakes twisted tighter with every passing second. One slip and the swarm would bury them alive beneath tons of rubble. But in that suspended beat, humanity's true edge gleamed. Not in superior tech, but in the unspoken trust that bound them together. Mark. Lena triggered the decoy signal. Alarms wailed below as the drones swarmed towards the false reading in the east tunnel, their formation fracturing momentarily. Thorn dropped a makeshift charge, rigged from outpost grenades and coolant accelerant, its fuse hissing like a promise of retribution. They vaulted over the grate, boots thudding onto the chamber floor in a coordinated rush. Chaos erupted in an instant. Drones peeled back from the east only to pivot sharply as the charge bloomed in fiery arcs, melting tendrils and shorting out the hub's outer shell in a shower of sparks. Jax laid down suppressing fire, his slugs punching through drone hulls in bursts of brilliant sparks. Each hit a small victory. A larger drone, a Guardian class judging by its bulky frame, detached from the ceiling with a mechanical screech, its beams lancing out like deadly spotlights. It clipped Lena's shoulder, spinning her into a nearby pillar with brutal force. She hit hard, her scanner skittering across the floor, but rolled to her feet in a fluid motion, drawing her pistol with blood-smeared fingers. "Keep pushing," she shouted, her voice raw but resolute. Thorn charged the hub, dodging beams that scorched the air around him, leaving trails of ozone. He slammed the stock of his slugger into a control node, cracking it open with a satisfying crunch. Wires sparked wildly. He jammed the barrel inside and fired a round that bloomed into a cascading overload, rippling feedback through the entire swarm. Drones stuttered mid-air, some plummeting to the ground in smoking wrecks. But the Guardian adapted swiftly, its chassis shifting to seal the damage with self-repairing alloy. It bore down on Jax, pinning him against a gantry with inexorable force. He twisted desperately, firing point-blank into its underbelly. But a beam grazed his leg, searing through fabric and flesh in a wave of agony. Thorn lunged forward, tackling the drone with raw, unyielding force. They crashed together in a tangle of limbs and metal, his arms locking around its thrusters as it strained to shake him off. "Lena, vent the core," he roared through gritted teeth, the machine's weight crushing down on him relentlessly. She scrambled to the exposed heart of the hub, overriding the alien locks with a scavenged tool. A jagged shard of hull plating that she used like a desperate key in a rusted lock. Sparks flew, biting at her skin through her suit, but she ignored the sting, her breath coming in ragged bursts as she worked. The core hummed beneath her touch, a pulsating orb of iridescent energy that thrummed with otherworldly menace, as if alive and aware of the threat. Thorn's roar still echoed in her ears, his body straining against the Guardian's relentless push. The grind of metal against flesh, a grim soundtrack to their fight. "Almost got it!" Lena's voice cracked with effort as the seal finally gave way with a sharp hiss, pressurized gas venting in a white plume that stung her eyes and filled the air with a chemical bite. She twisted the shard deeper, forcing the override sequence. The core's hum shifted, rising to a piercing whine that vibrated through the deck plates and into their bones. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, the tension hanging like a blade about to fall. Then, with a shudder that rippled across the entire chamber, the Guardian's thrusters flared erratically, blue flames licking out in uncontrolled bursts. The machine bucked wildly, its chassis heaving as if in mechanical agony, servos whining in protest. Thorn rolled free just in time, his shoulder slamming into the gantry with a crack that made Jax wince from his pinned position. Blood trickled from a fresh gash on his forehead, mixing with sweat. But he was up in an instant, grabbing Jax's arm and hauling him toward cover behind a cluster of toppled crates. "Move, it's going critical," Thorn urged, his voice hoarse. They scrambled into position, the air thickening with acrid smoke from melting circuits. The Guardian staggered forward, its adaptive armor fracturing along stress lines, shards of alloy pinging off the walls like shrapnel from a grenade. Lena dove after them, her tool clattering away as she hit the deck hard. The core detonated in a muffled roar, not the cataclysmic blast they'd feared and prepared for, but a directed surge of energy that fried the drone's internals in a cascade of failures. Circuits melted into slag, servos seized up with grinding halts, and the hulking form collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs, its optic sensors flickering out like dying stars in the void. Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the distant groan of the ship's hull settling and the patter of cooling debris raining down. Jax slumped against the crate, clutching his seared leg, his face pale but set in grim determination. The pain etched in every line. That was too close," he panted. "If you'd been a second slower, Thorn." "Save it," Thorn grunted, ripping a strip from his sleeve to bind Jax's wound. His hands were steady, calloused from years of frontier hauling and rough landings, but his eyes flicked warily to the fallen Guardian, ever vigilant. "It's down, but this ship's full of them. We need to find the bridge, shut down the swarm from the source before they regroup." Lena nodded, wiping soot from her face with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of grime. She was the smallest of them, wiry and quick. Her engineer's mind always 3 steps ahead, plotting contingencies. But doubt gnawed at her now. The aliens had analyzed every human ship that had crossed their territory, dissecting weaknesses in hulls, weapons, and crews with cold precision. Yet here they were, 3 salvagers turned intruders, turning their own tech against them in ways the invaders could never anticipate. The schematics we pulled from the outer ring. Bridge is 2 decks up past the engineering bays, she said, piecing it together. But the corridors are laced with sensors. 1 wrong step and we'll have a dozen more of those things on us in seconds. Jax pushed himself upright, testing his leg with a hiss of pain that echoed in the chamber. Brave to a fault, he never backed down from a fight, but caution tempered his fire now, the injury a stark reminder of their fragility. Then we don't take steps. We improvise. Thorn, you still got that breaching charge from the airlock? Thorn patted his vest, pulling out a compact cylinder, its casing dented from rough handling but still intact. 1 left. Could blast a path, but it'll draw every drone in the sector like flies to a corpse. Better than tiptoeing into a trap, Jax shot back, his voice sharp despite the limp as he steadied himself. We set it at the junction, collapse the side passages, force them into a bottleneck where we can pick them off one by one. Lena scanned the chamber with her multi-tool's faint glow, mapping the flickering readouts on its screen. Risky. The overload might destabilize the whole deck, bring the ceiling down on our heads, but yeah, it's our shot. She met their eyes, the weight of the decision settling like dust after the blast. These weren't elite soldiers. They were survivors, bonded by the grit of hauling scrap across uncharted stars, turning desperation into defiance. Humans didn't conquer with fleets or flawless algorithms. They endured, adapted, and transformed scrap into salvation. Thorn hefted the charge, priming it with a quick twist that armed the timer. On my mark. Jax, cover the flank. Lena, rig a diversion if they swarm early. They moved as 1 unit, slipping through the lingering haze of smoke toward the access ladder, the Guardian's smoldering corpse a testament to their ingenuity behind them. The ship groaned again, deeper this time, as if awakening fully to their intrusion, bulkheads creaking under the strain. Alarms wailed faintly in the distance, a siren's call summoning more Guardians from the shadows. As they climbed the ladder, Jax's breath hitched audibly, the pain in his leg a constant throbbing companion. Think they'll learn from this? Adapt even faster next time? Thorn glanced down from above, his grip iron on the rungs despite the ache in his own body. Let them try. We've got more where that came from. More fight, more tricks. The junction loomed ahead, a web of corridors pulsing with the dim red glow of emergency lights, casting everything in a bloody hue. Thorn slapped the charge onto the bulkhead, the timer beeping softly as it counted down, slicing through the tension like a knife. 10 seconds. They backed into position, weapons raised and ready, Jax's pulse rifle humming with charged energy, Lena clutching a makeshift arc welder like a lifeline, Thorn's slugger cocked and aimed. The blast ripped through the air like a thunderclap, shaking the ladder and sending chunks of ceiling raining down in a deadly hail. Drones swarmed from the side passages, their forms coalescing like shadows given teeth and purpose. But the collapsed walls funneled them into a narrow kill zone, turning the corridor into a gauntlet of their own making. Jax fired first, his shots cracking through armor and sending one tumbling end over end in a trail of sparks. "Here they come," he yelled, the words barely audible over the whine of servos and the roar of gunfire. Lena swung the arc welder, its blue arc lancing out to short a drone's sensors, blinding it mid-charge and sending it crashing into the wall. Thorn barreled forward, his slugger booming as he smashed through the lead unit, bullets punching deep into its core with brutal efficiency. They fought in sync, a brutal dance of lead and plasma that transformed the corridor into a wreckage-strewn nightmare. Sparks flew like fireflies caught in a storm, illuminating the twisted metal limbs of fallen machines littering the floor. Jax pivoted smoothly, his breath steady despite the acrid smoke stinging his eyes, and nailed another drone square in its optic cluster. It exploded in a shower of circuitry and molten components, buying them a heartbeat's respite amid the chaos. "Flank left," Thorn bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar cutting over the whine of advancing servos. He shouldered past Lena to shield her, reloading the slugger with a fresh magazine scavenged from his pack. The weapon's recoil had already bruised his shoulder black and blue, but he grinned through the pain, a wild, defiant slash across his face that spoke of too many bar fights won against worse odds on frontier outposts. Lena nodded sharply, her fingers white-knuckled on the welder's grip. She wasn't built for this frontline chaos. Her mind raced with schematics and structural weak points, not brute force assaults. But caution had its limits, and hesitation now meant certain death. She darted to the side, the arc flaring to life again, and targeted the underbelly of a hovering drone. The energy bolt connected solidly, melting through its propulsion vents in a shower of sparks. It plummeted to the floor, crashing into its kin and creating a chaotic pileup that slowed the swarm's advance. The drones adapted fast, their AI learning from each hit and countering with eerie speed. One peeled off from the group, cloaking itself in a shimmer of adaptive camouflage only to reappear inches from Jax's back, claws extended for a lethal strike. He spun on pure instinct, his rifle barking, but the shot only grazed its side, shearing off a panel but not stopping it. It lunged forward, claws aimed for his throat. Thorn saw it coming from the corner of his eye. Jax down. He charged like a freight train, slamming the butt of his slugger into the drone's chassis with all his weight behind it. The impact reverberated up his arms, denting the alloy but not quite stopping the machine's momentum. The drone twisted in response, countering with a vibroblade that sliced across Thorn's forearm, drawing a line of blood that welled hot and fast, soaking into his sleeve. "Damn it," he grunted, staggering back a step. He fired point blank, the slug tearing through the drone's torso and sending it skidding across the floor in a spray of lubricants and sparks. Jax was up in a flash, covering him with a burst of fire. "You good?" "Bleeding, not dying." Thorn shot back, wrapping a strip of torn sleeve around the wound to staunch the flow. His wit masked the wince of pain, but his eyes burned with unyielding focus. There was no time for pity or pause. The swarm was thinning, but more poured in from a side vent, their numbers relentless and unending. Lena analyzed the pattern even mid-fight, her cautious nature kicking in like a reflex. "They're prioritizing us because of the breach. If we seal that vent later," Jax cut her off, his bravery serving as a steady anchor in the storm. He unleashed a burst from the pulse rifle, collapsing a section of the wall near the vent in a tumble of debris. It partially blocked the flow of reinforcements, but it wasn't enough to stem the tide completely. A larger drone emerged from the shadows then, its frame bulkier and more heavily armed, weapons arrayed like a predator's arsenal ready to strike. It scanned them briefly, its emitters glowing as it assessed their weaknesses, drawing from the vast data the aliens had compiled on humans. Fragile flesh that tore easily, predictable responses rooted in fear and survival instinct. The big one fired first, a plasma arc scorching the air and melting a ladder rung where Thorn had stood just a second before. He rolled aside, coming up firing, his slugs ricocheting off its reinforced plating with dull thuds. "This one's armored." "Hit the joints," Thorn called out, adapting on the fly as human grit turned raw desperation into improvised strategy. Lena feinted with the welder, drawing its attention with a flare of blue energy, while Jax targeted the leg servos with precise pulses from his rifle. Sparks erupted as her shots weakened the struts, creating openings. Thorn closed the distance, ignoring the gash on his arm that throbbed with every heartbeat, and drove his slugger's bayonet into a seam in the armor. The drone bucked violently, its servos whining in protest, but it managed a glancing blow that sent Thorn sprawling across the deck. Pain lanced through his side, his ribs protesting with every shallow breath. He tasted copper on his tongue from a bitten lip, but he pushed up to his knees, defiant to his core. "Not today," he growled, refusing to yield. Jax and Lena pressed the attack without mercy. Lena's arc struck the exposed joint, fusing metal in a brilliant flash that lit the corridor. Jax followed with a sustained beam from the pulse rifle, the weapon overheating in his hands but holding just long enough to finish the job. The drone seized up, then crumpled to the floor in a final futile spasm, its systems overloading in a burst of smoke. The corridor fell quieter at last, save for the crackle of dying electronics and their own ragged breaths echoing off the walls. But victory tasted bittersweet. Thorn slumped against the wall, blood seeping through his makeshift bandage, the wound deeper than he'd admitted. Infection was a looming threat in this forsaken lab, where medical supplies were as scarce as hope. "We can't stay here," Jax said, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and helping Thorn to his feet. His voice held no tremor, only the pure resolve of someone who'd stared down worse. Lena scavenged a med patch from the drone's wreckage, ironic salvation from their alien foes, and applied it swiftly to Thorn's arm, her hand steady despite the flicker of fear in her eyes. They pressed on, the path ahead twisting into deeper shadows, the air growing colder and more oppressive. The aliens' analysis had missed one crucial variable. Humans didn't break easily. But the cost of their endurance was mounting with every step, and the heart of this place still pulsed with unknown horrors waiting to be unleashed. The dim glow of emergency strips flickered along the corridor walls, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters in the half-light. Thorn leaned heavier on Jax's shoulder than he cared to admit, each step sending a fresh jolt of pain through his side, where the med patch clung precariously, already darkening with seepage. The alien alloy underfoot hummed faintly, a constant reminder that this ship, lab, prison, whatever it truly was, still breathed with artificial life, its systems alert to their every move. "Scans picking up something ahead," Lena whispered, her tablet screen casting a pale blue light on her tense face. She adjusted the makeshift antenna they'd jury-rigged from drone parts earlier, her fingers nimble despite the grime caking her nails. "Heat signatures, multiple, not ours," she added, her voice low. Jax nodded, easing Thorn against a bulkhead for a moment's support. "How many?" "5, maybe 6. Stationary but clustered tight. Could be another analysis chamber." Lena's voice stayed level, but her eyes darted to Thorn's wound, the patch already showing signs of failure. They couldn't afford another full fight, not with him slowing them down. Thorn gritted his teeth, pushing off the wall with a suppressed groan. "Then we skirt it. No heroics." His words came out clipped and rough, but the grit in them pulled Jax's gaze. Brave to a fault even when his body betrayed him with every movement. They crept forward cautiously, the air growing thicker, laced with a metallic tang that burned the back of their throats. Jax took point, rifle raised and sweeping, his cautious nature keeping their pace deliberate and measured. A junction loomed ahead, branches splitting left and right into inky voids that seemed to swallow the light. Lena's tablet beeped softly. The cluster lay straight ahead, just beyond a reinforced hatch that gleamed ominously. "Detour left," Jax murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Less chance of tripping their sensors. But as they turned, a low whine echoed from the walls like servos awakening from slumber. Overhead lights snapped on without warning, harsh and unyielding, flooding the space with sterile white illumination that left no shadows to hide in. Thorn cursed under his breath, clutching his side as pain flared. "They know we're here." Footsteps, not human, too precise and mechanical, clattered from the right branch, growing louder with each echo. 3 figures emerged. Tall, spindly aliens in exosuits that hummed with contained power, their multifaceted eyes glinting with cold intelligence as they leveled energy lances at the intruders. Not drones this time. These moved with deliberate intent, analyzing their prey in real time, adapting to the human's presence on the fly. "Flank," Jax barked, shoving Lena behind a protruding panel for cover. He fired first, his shots cracking against an alien's shield and forcing it to stagger back a step. Thorn dropped to one knee, adding his suppressed bursts. Witty under fire, he aimed for joints rather than centers of mass, exploiting the suit's inherent rigidity. One alien lunged forward, its lance humming with building charge, the air crackling around the tip. Lena dodged aside, her tablet forgotten on the floor as she grabbed a loose conduit pipe and swung it like a makeshift bat. The impact sparked against the exosuit, shorting out a limb's servos. The creature toppled awkwardly, but not before its lance grazed her arm, searing through fabric and skin in a line of blistering pain. "Got your back," Thorn growled, covering her retreat with a volley of shots that pinned the other 2 aliens behind a bulkhead. Jax circled wide, his movements fluid yet cautious, unrelenting in his advance. He triggered a grenade from their scavenged stock, human ingenuity packed into a simple tin can, and rolled it under the cluster of aliens. The blast rattled the corridor like an earthquake, shredding 2 exosuits in a bloom of fire and flying debris that peppered the walls. The last alien adapted quickly, its lance arcing toward Jax in a sweeping motion. He rolled beneath it, coming up with a knife he'd sharpened from hull scraps, slashing at its underbelly where the armor was thinnest. It shrieked, a sound like tearing foil echoing through the confined space, before collapsing in a heap of twitching limbs and leaking fluids. Silence fell once more, broken only by their heaving breaths and the faint sizzle of damaged tech. Lena pressed a hand to her burn, wincing but already scanning the wreckage with her recovered tablet. Their logs, it's all here. They were prepping a neural probe. For us. Thorn stood slowly, fresh blood spotting the floor from his wounds. Means we're close to whatever they're hiding at the core. But we're leaking time and blood like a sieve. Jack slung his rifle, his eyes fixed on the deeper path ahead. Then we push. No choice left now. The hatch ahead hissed open on its own as if inviting them, revealing a chamber pulsing with bioluminescent veins that crawled along the walls like living circuitry. Whatever waited inside had felt their intrusion, and it hungered for more data to dissect their flaws. Jack stepped through the hatch first, his boots scraping against the slick-veined floor that throbbed faintly like a living heart beneath them. The chamber stretched wide, its walls crawling with luminous tendrils that snaked toward the newcomers, probing the air with subtle twitches. A low hum vibrated through his bones, not mechanical but organic, as if the ship itself were breathing, inhaling their presence. "Stay sharp," he muttered, rifle raised and sweeping the shadows for threats. The tendrils quivered inches from his arm but held back, like they were tasting the space between, assessing without committing. Lena followed close behind, her scanner beeping erratically in her hand as it struggled to process the readings. Biosigns everywhere. This isn't a room. It's an organ. Neural network, maybe. They're wired right into it. Thorn limped in last, sealing the hatch with a grunt of effort that pulled at his wounds. Blood seeped through his makeshift bandage, but his eyes remained steady, scanning for exits and dangers. If it's a trap, we spring it now. No point in skulking around like ghosts. The tendrils surged then, lashing out in a whip of light that cracked like lightning. Jax fired instinctively, the shot echoing like a thunderclap through the chamber, severing one tendril clean. It writhed on the floor, dissolving into acrid smoke that filled the air with a choking haze. More came faster, wrapping around Lena's leg and yanking her off balance with surprising strength. She hit the ground hard, her scanner skittering away across the slick floor. "Jax, cut it free!" Jax dove forward, knife flashing in the bioluminescent glow. But the tendril tightened its grip, pulling her inexorably toward the wall where a cluster of pods pulsed open like blooming flowers. Inside, shadowy forms stirred. Analyzers, the logs had called them. Specialized drones built to dissect minds and extract data. Thorn charged ahead, ignoring the fire in his wounds, and stomped down on the base of the tendril with his boot. It snapped with a wet organic pop, freeing Lena in a spray of viscous fluid. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her scanner just as another wave of tendrils attacked from all sides. "They're learning," Lena gasped, dodging a probe that grazed her shoulder and drew a thin line of blood. "Adapting to our moves. We hit one, they counter twice as hard, like they're evolving in real time." Jax backed them toward the center of the chamber, where a raised dais glowed with holographic data streams, detailed schematics of human anatomy. Weaknesses mapped out in cold blue light, fragile joints prone to dislocation, vulnerable nerves that could be overloaded. The chaos of human emotion rendered as exploitable variables. "That's their playbook," Jack said, nodding toward the display. "Burn it, wipe the slate clean." Thorn nodded grimly, ripping a plasma flare from his belt with his good hand. He hurled it at the dais, the flare igniting mid-air in a burst of white-hot heat that consumed the holograms in a digital scream, a wailing feedback that made Jax's ears ring and his head throb. But the tendrils retaliated viciously, coiling around Thorn's arm and slamming him against the wall with bone-jarring force. He roared in pain, twisting free with raw determination, but not before it injected something. A thin needle piercing his skin, delivering a toxin that spread like liquid fire through his veins. His face paled instantly, vision blurring at the edges as dizziness set in. "Thorn!" Jack shouted, laying down suppressive fire to cover him. Sparks flew as the tendrils retracted momentarily, regrouping for another assault. Lena reached the dais, overriding the controls with a hasty hack from her scanner. Data flooded her screen. The aliens' grand experiment laid bare, probing human flaws to predict and force surrender. But the logs lied. Humans didn't break like brittle code. They bent, improvised, and endured beyond all calculations. A central pod cracked open then, revealing the core analyzer, a hulking form of segmented limbs and glowing eyes, designed to analyze their every flinch and response. It lunged at Lena with terrifying speed, but Thorn, fighting through the haze of the toxin, tackled it from the side in a desperate bid. They crashed together in a heap, his hands clamping down on its primary joint with desperate strength. "Twist it!" He growled through gritted teeth, his voice strained. Like the outer hull, weak at the seams, remember? Jax joined the fray, his knife prying at the seam while Lena fed erratic power surges from the dais controls. The analyzer bucked wildly, its eyes flashing error codes in rapid succession, but they held on, muscles burning with effort. With a final, wrenching twist, the joint gave way. Icor sprang across the floor as the machine collapsed in violent spasms, its systems failing in a cascade. The chamber dimmed gradually, the tendrils wilting like dead vines deprived of sustenance. Thorne slumped against the wall, sweat beading on his forehead as the toxin burned through him, sapping his strength. "We got it," Lena said, her voice tight as she checked his injection site, probing for signs of spread. "But this ship's core is next, and whatever's guarding it knows we're coming now, full alert." Jax reloaded his rifle with shaking hands, glancing at the faded holograms on the dais. Their weaknesses had been exposed for all to see, but their strength? That was something uniquely theirs to wield. Unquantifiable and unbreakable. Thorne pushed to his feet, defiant despite the pain lancing through his body. "Then we show it what humans are really made of." Thorne's vision blurred at the edges as the toxin clawed deeper into his veins, turning every heartbeat into a pulse of fire. But he forced his legs to move, one deliberate step after the other, refusing to let it slow him. The corridor ahead pulsed with faint red lights like veins throbbing under synthetic skin, guiding them deeper into the ship's bowels. Jax flanked him closely, rifle slung low and ready, while Lena scanned the walls with her makeshift probe, its screen flickering with stolen data from the analyzer's mangled corpse. "Core's 2 decks down," she whispered, her voice steady despite the sweat tracing lines down her temples from the heat and exertion. "But the schematics show guardians, automated sentinels, adaptive to any threat they encounter. They'll learn from us fast, adjust their tactics on the fly." Jax grunted in acknowledgement, kicking aside a coil of severed tendril that still twitched faintly on the floor. "Let 'em. We've got momentum on our side now." He glanced at Thorne, concern flickering in his eyes. "You hanging in there?" Thorne nodded curtly, biting back the fire in his arm and the growing nausea, long enough to end this. He pressed a hand to the wound, the makeshift bandage already darkening with fresh seepage. There was no time for weakness. The ship groaned around them, a low hum building like distant thunder as if the vessel itself sensed their approach and stirred in response. They reached the access shaft, its hatch sealed with a lattice of glowing energy filaments that crackled with warning. Lena jacked in her probe, her fingers flying over the controls in a blur of motion. Sparks danced across the connections as the system resisted her intrusion, then finally yielded with a reluctant hiss. The hatch irised open, revealing a vertical drop lined with glowing conduits that hummed with power. "Down," Thorne ordered, holstering his sidearm for the descent. He dropped first, his boots hitting the lower platform with a clang that echoed too loudly in the confined space. Jax followed, covering the shadows below with his rifle, while Lena slid down last, sealing the hatch behind her with a quick override. The lower deck unfolded as a maze of throbbing machinery, the air thick with the sharp scent of ozone from overworked systems. Distant clanks suggested movement, patrols awakening to their presence, stirring from standby. Thorne led them forward, hugging the walls to minimize their profile, his breath shallow to mask the pain that each inhale brought. A junction loomed ahead, 3 paths branching out. Left to engineering subroutes filled with humming generators, right to auxiliary power nodes, straight to the core chamber itself. Lena paused, her probe humming softly as it analyzed. "Straits trapped. Pressure sensors everywhere. Step on one and the whole corridor locks down. Left might loop us around, but it'll take too much time we don't have." Jax peered down the right path, his eyes narrowing. "Power nodes exposed there. Cut it and we blind whatever's waiting at the core, at least temporarily." Thorne weighed the options quickly, the toxin urging haste over his natural caution. "Right. Quick and dirty. Get in, hit it, get out." They moved, their footsteps muffled on the grated floor that vibrated underfoot. The right path narrowed quickly, the walls closing in like the throat of some massive beast until they spotted the node. A pulsating orb of blue light, tendrils of cabling feeding into it like arteries. Jax knelt beside it, unpacking small charges from his pack with practiced hands. "These'll do it. 30 seconds to detonate and overload." But as he wired the first charge, a shadow detached silently from the ceiling above. A sentinel unfolded itself, sleek and multi-limbed, its chassis iridescent under the dim lights, sensors whirring as it assessed the threat. It didn't charge with brute force. Instead, it mirrored Jax's posture, mimicking the tool in his hand with eerie precision as if learning from observation. "Adaptation," Lena hissed, drawing her pistol in a flash. "It's copying us, our movements, our tools." The thing lunged then, not wildly but with calculated precision, its limb extending like a whip to snatch the charge from Jax's grasp. He rolled aside just in time, firing a burst that scorched its flank and sent it recoiling. It adjusted instantly, its armor shifting to deflect the next shots with hardened plating. Thorn shoved Lena behind a nearby console for cover, his own gun barking in rapid succession. Bullets pinged off the hardening plates, ineffective against the adaptation. "Flank it." "Don't let it learn our pattern," Thorn shouted, circling to the side. Jax obliged, knife drawn and slashing at the joints where armor was thinnest. The sentinel pivoted, predicting his arc with uncanny accuracy, and countered with a stunning pulse that grazed his shoulder, numbing his arm and causing him to drop the second charge. It skittered away across the floor. Lena fired from cover, her shots wild but forcing the machine to divide its attention, buying precious seconds. Thorn saw the opening, the vulnerable tendril link connecting the sentinel to the node pulsing with energy. He lunged forward, ignoring the scream of pain from his wound, and drove his knife deep into the connection. Ichor sprayed out in a foul arc, the node flickering erratically as power surged and failed. The sentinel shrieked a digital wail of protest and thrashed wildly. Its limb caught Thorn's side in the chaos, hurling him against the wall with bone-rattling force. Pain exploded through him, but he held onto the knife, twisting until the link severed completely with a final snap. The node dimmed to darkness, the corridor plunging into stuttering shadows as emergency backups kicked in. Jax recovered quickly, scooping up the charges and slamming one against the sentinel's core. Boom time. The blast ripped through the confined space, shards of metal embedding in the walls as the machine crumpled, its sparks dying out in feeble flickers. Alarms blared shipwide, the hum rising to a frantic roar as systems destabilized. Lena helped Thorn to his feet, her face pale with worry. "Power's destabilizing across the board. The core's exposed now, but so are we. Every drone on this deck will be converging here." He leaned on her for support, tasting blood on his lips from the impact. "Then we push forward. No turning back, not after all this." They pressed on through the shuddering ship, every shadow a potential threat, the toxin burning hotter in Thorn's veins, but his grip on his weapon tightening with resolve. Strength wasn't in the machine's cold analysis. It was in the fight that followed, the human will to survive against all odds. Thorn's boots skidded on the grated floor as the ship's groans intensified, like a wounded beast cornered and thrashing in its death throes. He wiped blood from his lip with the back of his hand, the metallic tang mixing with the acrid smoke wafting from the sentinel's wreckage. Lena flanked him at the junction ahead, her rifle sweeping methodically while Jax covered their rear, his breath ragged but steady despite his injuries. "Two corridors branch left and right," Lena whispered, her eyes flicking to her scanner's readouts. "Cores straight through, but readings show patrols converging from all sides. We split up or we die bottled up in a crossfire." Thorn shook his head firmly, his vision blurring at the edges from the toxin's relentless gnaw. "No split. They want to divide us, classic divide and conquer tactic. We go straight, use the debris for cover and hit them hard." Jax grunted in agreement, hefting a scavenged panel like an improvised shield. "Straight it is. But if that roars the core venting plasma, we're racing leaks that could cook us alive. One wrong step and we're vaporized." They moved as a unit, merging with the flickering shadows cast by the emergency lights. The corridor narrowed further, walls pulsing with exposed conduits that sparked like angry veins, arcing electricity into the air. Thorn led the way, knife in one hand and pistol in the other, every step a calculated press against the mounting pain. Behind them, the alarms wailed on, a symphony of the ship's dying rage urging the defenders onward. A patrol rounded the bend ahead, 3 sentinels, sleeker and more agile than the last, their crimson optics locking on with a glow that pierced the gloom. Lasers lanced out instantly, scorching the air and forcing Thorn to dive behind a bulkhead, the heat singeing the edge of his sleeve. "Flank 'em. Jax, take the high ground," Thorn commanded, his voice cutting through the din. Jax scaled a nearby service ladder in 2 powerful bounds, perching like a gargoyle on the upper ledge. He lobbed a charge not directly at the machines, but at the ceiling grate above them. Metal screamed as it buckled under the impact, raining debris in a controlled avalanche that crushed one sentinel outright and staggered the others. Another fired wildly in response, its beam grazing Jax's leg and drawing a hiss of pain, but Lena rolled forward from cover, her shot precise and deadly, drilling into the third's joint and toppling it into the sparking conduits below. The victory was short-lived. From the fallen wreckage, a smaller security drone detached itself, buzzing like an angry hornet, its stinger a needle tipped with suppressant gas designed to incapacitate. Thorn lunged forward, swatting it midair with his knife. The thing shattered against the blade, but not before spraying its load across his chest. He coughed harshly, the new toxin hitting like ice in his lungs, slowing his reflexes and clouding his thoughts further. Keep moving. Can't let it adapt to our hesitation. They pushed into the core chamber at last, a vast dome where the heart of the ship thrummed visibly. A colossal reactor with coolant lines hissing steam into the air, venting pressure in erratic bursts. Holographic displays flickered with alien script around the perimeter, analyzing in real time, human vitals spiking, weaknesses cataloged and updated with every scan, heart rates elevated, adrenaline surging, all deemed predictable and exploitable. Lena hacked into a nearby console, her fingers flying across the interface. Shields are down 40%, but they're rerouting power from backups, buying time to purge us from the system entirely. Jax limped to a control panel, prying it open with his multi-tool despite the pain. Time's what we don't have. Thorn, cover me. I'm bridging the auxiliary lines. Force a feedback loop to overload the whole thing. Thorn nodded, positioning himself at the entrance to the chamber, rifle braced. More drones swarmed now, a cloud of them descending like locusts, but he fired in controlled bursts, each shot an act of defiance against the tide. One clipped his shoulder, drawing fresh blood that trickled warm down his arm, but he didn't falter. Grit wasn't quantifiable data. It was the choice to stand when the body screamed to quit, when every instinct urged retreat. The reactor whined, higher in pitch, lights dimming across the chamber as Jax worked feverishly. Almost there, Jax muttered, sweat dripping from his brow. Humans don't break like code. We reroute to adapt or die. Lena glanced at Thorn, her caution cracking into pure resolve. If this fails, we're the overload, vaporized in the blast. A massive shudder rocked the chamber then, bulkheads sealing with hydraulic hisses, the air thickening with building pressure, as the ship tried to contain them. The analysis screens glitched wildly, overwhelmed by the sabotage. Thorn's world, narrowed to the fight at hand. Dodge a beam, fire a shot, endure the pain. Jax yanked a final wire into place, sparks erupting in a fountain around him. The reactor howled in response, power surging back in a reverse cascade that lit the chamber in strobing blue. Drones faltered mid-air, dropping like stones as their systems fried. The ship buckled around them, a deep groan echoing through the hull as structural integrity failed. They retreated to a side alcove just as explosions rippled outward, the core's safeguards collapsing in a spectacular chain reaction of fire and debris. Thorn slumped against the wall, his breath shallow and labored, but he was alive, the toxin burning but not breaking him. In the stuttering light, Lena's voice cut through the din. We did it. But extraction's compromised. The bay's venting to space now. Jax smirked through the pain, wiping blood from his face. Then we improvise a ride home. Humans always do. That's our real strength. Thorn's vision blurred at the edges once more, the toxin's fire gnawing deeper into his veins. But he forced his legs to keep moving, drawing on reserves he didn't know he had. The alcove's shadows clung to them like reluctant allies, the ship's groans providing a constant, ominous underscore to their ragged breaths and the distant rumble of failing systems. Lena crouched nearby, her fingers flying over a salvaged datapad, its screen flickering with half-formed schematics of the docking bay she'd pulled from fragmented logs. Jax leaned heavily against a bulkhead, one hand clamped over a deep gash in his side to stem the bleeding, the other clutching a makeshift pry bar fashioned from a shattered panel. Bay's a mess, Lena muttered, her voice steady despite the sweat beading on her forehead from the tension. Vents are cycling atmosphere straight into vacuum. Drones are regrouping. Scans show 3 squads converging from the outer hull, cutting off escape routes. Thorn spat a mouthful of blood onto the deck, the coppery taste lingering on his tongue.
How long before they pin us down completely? Minutes at best, she replied, glancing up with sharp, focused eyes. The core overload bought us some time, but it's drawing every system alert on board like a beacon. We need a way out. Shuttles.
Trashed from earlier hits, escape pods are locked down tight. Jax pushed off the wall, wincing as he tested his weight on his injured leg. His usual smirk was absent, replaced by a grim focus that aged him, hardening the lines around his eyes. Improvising's our specialty, remember? Back on Epsilon Drift, we turned a derelict mining rig into a battering ram to punch through an asteroid field. That was against a rock, not a warship full of adaptive hunters. Lena countered, her jaw tightening as her cautious streak surfaced. But she didn't argue further, recognizing the necessity. Instead, she tapped the datapad, pulling up a wireframe model of the adjacent maintenance tunnel. This leads to the auxiliary thrusters, if we reroute power there. A distant clang echoed through the corridors, metal striking metal, the unmistakable first sign of pursuit closing in. Thorn's pulse spiked, adrenaline cutting through the toxin's haze. He grabbed the knife from his belt, its edge still stained from the earlier skirmish, gripping it like an old friend. Talk fast, they're close, too close. Jax nodded, already moving toward the alcove's access panel. He jammed the pry bar in, with a grunt, muscles straining as he forced it open with a screech that set Thorn's teeth on edge. Cool air rushed out, carrying the faint ozone tang of exposed wiring and high-voltage systems. Thrusters it is, Jax said, decisive. We overload the maneuvering jets, create a debris field to cover our exit, then hotwire a cargo hauler from the bay. It's bulky, but it'll get us clear. Lena hesitated for a beat, her brave streak warring with the calculated risks flashing across her mind. That could shear the hull open. We're talking uncontrolled spin. Anyone not strapped in becomes paste against the walls. Better than waiting here for dissection, Thorn replied, his words coming out rough and edged with pain, but he stepped forward anyway, slinging his rifle over his good shoulder. The toxin made every motion a battle against his own body. But backing down wasn't an option, not after glimpsing those alien consoles, with their cold dissections of human flaws. Fragile bodies that failed under stress, emotional ties that could be severed, predictable rage that blinded judgment. They'd laughed bitterly at the screens earlier, turning the invaders' underestimation into fuel for their fire. The tunnel swallowed them whole now, a narrow vein of pipes and conduits pulsing with residual energy, the walls close enough to brush their shoulders. Jax took point, his steps deliberate and measured, knife at the ready to slice through insulation or cabling if needed. Lena followed, datapad clipped to her vest, muttering adjustments under her breath as she monitored the ship's responses. Thorn brought up the rear, ears straining for the telltale hum of drones or the clatter of alien feet. Halfway through, the ship shuddered violently, a secondary explosion from the core rippling shockwaves that bucked them against the walls like rag dolls. Thorn's head cracked against a protruding valve, stars bursting in his sight as pain lanced through his skull. He bit back a curse, hauling himself up as Jax called back over his shoulder. Keep moving. That's our window. The chaos is distracting them. They burst into the thruster compartment, a cavernous space alive with the whine of cooling fans and the low thrum of idling engines. Consoles blinked erratically along the walls, emergency lights casting long shadows over the massive nozzles that pointed toward the void. Lena dove for the nearest control station, her fingers dancing across the keys as she initiated the reroute. Power's rerouting now. Jax, seal the hatch behind us. Buy us time. He complied without question, using a plasma torch scavenged from his pack to weld it shut. Sparks flew in bright arcs, illuminating the determination etched on his face like scars. Done? How's it looking on your end? Power's unstable. 30 seconds to full surge, she replied, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of what that meant. One wrong sequence in the code, and they'd vent themselves straight into the vacuum, their bodies flash frozen in an instant. Alarms blared suddenly, red strobes pulsing across the compartment like a heartbeat gone mad. The hatch rattled under assault, drones cutting tools slicing through the metal with high-pitched whines. Thorn leveled his rifle, firing short bursts through the weakening seams to keep them at bay. They're here. Hold the line. The first drone breached the hatch,
A sleek predator of alloy and sensors, its limbs unfolding like a nightmare given form. Bullets pinged off its chassis, but Thorn aimed true for the joints, dropping it in a shower of fragments that clattered across the deck. Another followed, faster and more aggressive, its energy lance grazing his arm and searing flesh through the suit. He rolled aside, the pain blending seamlessly with the toxin's burn, and drove his knife into its core with a savage twist. Jax joined the fray, swinging the pry bar like an extension of his arm, crushing a sensor cluster on the third intruder and buying Lena the precious seconds she needed to complete the sequence. "Now!" she shouted, slamming the final command. The thrusters ignited prematurely. A deafening roar that shook the compartment to its foundations. The ship lurched wildly, artificial gravity failing in rolling waves that sent them tumbling. They grasped at handholds desperately as the hull screamed in protest, metal twisting under the strain. Through a narrow viewport, Thorn glimpsed the chaos outside. Debris ejecting in swirling clouds to form a makeshift shield, cargo bay doors peeling back under the overload's force. Lena strapped into a maintenance harness, hauling Thorn and Jax toward the hauler dock with wiry strength. It's working, sort of. The hauler's powering up on auxiliary systems. But the cost was mounting with every second. A final drone slipped through the breached hatch, latching onto Jax's leg with mechanical claws that dug in deep. He roared in fury, smashing it down against the deck, but not before it injected something. A fresh dose of toxin, or perhaps something worse, paralyzing agents flooding his system. His face paled as he limped forward, the limb going numb. "Go on. I'll cover the rear." "No," Lena snapped, her wit sharpening into unyielding resolve. She yanked him along, her smaller frame belying the iron strength beneath. "We all ride home, no one left behind." They piled into the hauler, a bulky transport designed for freight rather than fugitives, its controls dusty from disuse. Thorn punched the ignition sequence, the engines coughing to life amid the spinning wreckage and alarms wailing in protest. The ship twisted away from them, bulkheads groaning as they broke free into the void, the hauler shuddering violently as it cleared the debris field. Engines strained against the pull of the alien ship's failing gravity well, but Thorn gripped the controls, his knuckles white, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill seeping through the hull breaches. Jack slumped into the co-pilot seat, his leg a throbbing mess where the drone's claw had torn through his suit, the injected toxin spreading like fire in his veins, locking muscles in painful spasms. Lena knelt beside him, ripping open a med kit with steady hands, her voice cutting through the blaring alarms like a knife through fog. "Hold still, you big lug. This nanite slurry's all we've got. It might burn like hell, but it'll slow the spread long enough to get you patched." Jax grunted, teeth clenched against the pain, as she jammed the injector into his thigh. The stuff hissed on contact, bubbling up through the wound, and he slammed a fist against the armrest, the hauler bucking slightly from the vibration transmitted through the frame. "Feels like acid eating me from the inside," he rasped. "Whatever that thing pumped into me. It's rewriting something. Muscles are locking up, vision spotting." Thorn shot a quick glance back, his cautious nature warring with the urgent need to push the throttle harder. "We can't dock blind like this. Sensors are fried. Half the fleet out there are ghosts now, picking off stragglers in the chaos." The view screen flickered intermittently, showing fractured hulls drifting like broken toys through the void, remnants of the alien armada, scattering under the sudden counterattack from human reinforcements that had finally arrived. But one shadow loomed larger on the display, a sleek interceptor craft, its engines flaring blue as it locked onto their trail with predatory focus. Lena sealed the wound with a hasty patch, her mind racing through contingencies. She'd seen the briefing vids on these xeno-hunters, how they analyzed human weaknesses from afar, deploying drones and custom toxins to exploit fragile biology, turning strengths into fatal flaws. But up close in the thick of it, humans didn't break clean. They fought dirty, improvised, and surprised. "Thorn, vector us toward that gas giant," she directed, pointing to the swirling orb on the nav chart. "The rings. Use the debris for cover. It'll mask our signature." "Jax, talk to me. Can you stand and fight if it comes to that?" He tested his leg gingerly, wincing as it spasmed under him, but nodded through the haze of pain. "Yeah, grit through it, always do." "What's the play here?" The interceptor closed fast, its weapons priming with a distant whine that vibrated through the deck plates. Thorn banked the hauler hard,
the ship groaning as it dove toward the gas giant's swirling rings of ice and rock encircling the planet like a glittering noose. Shards pinged off the weakened shields, each impact a stark reminder of how thin their margin for error had become. "They're matching our vector," Thorn reported, sweat trickling into his eyes. "Point defense active. Can't shake 'em clean without more power we don't have." Lena hauled Jax to his feet, slinging his arm over her shoulder, her wiry frame bearing his weight without a complaint, though her muscles strained. A flash of wit sparked in her eyes, even now cutting the tension. "Then we don't shake them off. We bait them in." She pointed to the cargo bay controls on the console. "Haulers loaded with those mining charges from the depot run we salvaged. Rig 'em to the bay doors, detonate on proximity. Turn this pig into a floating minefield." Thorn's eyes widened, the cautious pilot in him balking at the recklessness. "That's our only ordnance left. One wrong pulse in the timing and we're vaporized along with it." Jax coughed, a wet rasp escaping his throat, but his voice held steady, laced with defiance. "Do it, I'll set the timers myself. You fly erratic, she covers the flanks." He limped toward the bay access, each step a battle against the toxin twisting his nerves, but his will remained unbroken. Lena followed, grabbing a pulse rifle from the overhead rack, her resolve hardening into something fierce and unyielding as she braced for what came next. The interceptor fired a warning shot, a grazing beam that scorched the hauler's flank, alarms blaring as non-critical systems flickered and died. Thorn weaved through the ring's denser clusters, massive ice boulders tumbling in their wake like an avalanche in slow motion, buying them precious seconds. In the cargo bay, Jax knelt by the crates despite the pain, his fingers fumbling with the detonators, sweat mixing with the residue of the med slurry on his skin. "Charges armed and ready," he called over the internal comm. "Synced to our shields dropping. Give the word when they're close." Lena braced at the inner hatch to the bay, rifle humming with charged energy. "Thorn, drop shields on my mark." "Let 'em think we're done, shields failing from the damage." The pursuer matched their dive with arrogant speed, closing to point-blank range, its tractor beam locking on with an ominous hum. Thorn's voice crackled over the comm, tense. "They're locking the tractor beam. 5 seconds to full contact. Mark!" Lena shouted, her command sharp. Shields winked out across the hauler. The interceptor surged forward confidently, its bay doors yawning open to snag its prize and reel them in. Jax hit the release, charges tumbling into the void like scattered seeds from a pod. The Xeno ship plowed straight through the cloud, explosions blooming in silent fury against the vacuum, ripping into its underbelly with chain reactions of fire and rupturing hulls, plates buckled outward, engines erupting in a spectacular chain of plasma that lit the rings like a false dawn breaking. The hauler lurched free of the beam's grip, debris pelting the hull as Thorn punched the throttle away, putting distance between them and the dying ship. Jax collapsed against the bulkhead, his breathing ragged and labored, the toxin still gnawing at him, but the immediate threat finally gone. Lena lowered her rifle slowly, a grim smile breaking through the exhaustion on her face. "One down. But that fleet's not finished, not by a long shot." A new ping echoed on the sensors. Reinforcements. But these were human signatures closing in fast from the ring's outer arc. They weren't alone anymore, the tide had turned. Jax met her gaze across the cabin, defiance sparking in his eyes despite the pain. "We held. That's enough for now. More than they ever predicted." Jax gripped the edge of the console, his vision blurring at the edges from the toxin's lingering bite. But the sensors didn't lie or deceive. Human signatures, 3 fighters, sleek and unmarked with the scars of battle, vectoring in from the ring's outer arc, their engines humming with that unmistakable Terran roar that cut through the void. "Thorn," he rasped, wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. "Can we outrun them? Or is this another trap?" Thorn's hands flew over the controls, the hauler banking hard to evade a drifting chunk of ice. "Not without shedding more mass we can't spare. They're matching our burn, closing fast, but their transponders read friendly." Lena scanned the readouts intently, her fingers tracing the incoming vectors on the flickering screen. "Wait, those aren't pirate codes or xenoghosts. Look at the transponders, old UNSC surplus models, but they're active and broadcasting clean. They're hailing us, stand by." The comm crackled open before Jax could respond, a voice cutting through like gravel over tempered steel, rough from too many hours in a cockpit. "Hauler Delta 7, this is Vanguard 3. Stand down and prepare for escort. You've got tails we don't want nipping at our heels out here. Nice flying, by the way. Jax exchanged a glance with Lena, her eyes narrowing in a mix of wary hope and lingering suspicion. Thorn eased off the throttle cautiously, the ship settling into a wary drift amid the debris field, engines idling as the fighters slotted into formation around them. Their hulls were scarred from recent battles Jax could only guess at, running lights pulsing in sync like a protective cordon. "Who are you people?" Jax asked, leaning into the mic with a voice steadier than he felt. A pause hung in the air. Then a chuckle rumbled through the comm, rough and genuine, born of shared hardships, the kind who don't leave their own out here to rot in the black. "Name's Reyes, captain of this wing. We picked up your fireworks show back there. Nice work scrapping that interceptor, but the Xenoswarm's regrouping fast. We've got a narrow window to punch out system, but it's tight. Stick close." Lena leaned in toward the mic, her voice steady and probing. "We're carrying critical cargo, data on their analysis tech. If you're really human—" "We are," Reyes interrupted, her tone sharpening with impatience and authenticity. "And we've got scores to settle with those probe-dropping bastards. They thought they could dissect our weaknesses from afar, send in drones to poke and prod, map our every flinch. But up close in the fight, they learned quick just how wrong they were." The hauler shuddered as docking clamps engaged from one of the fighters, a makeshift bridge extending across the void like a lifeline tossed into the storm. Jax stood slowly, ignoring the ache in his limbs from the toxin, and nodded to Thorn. "Link up. Let's get this done. Home's waiting." They transferred in waves across the precarious bridge, the hauler's hold secured and locked down behind them to prevent any surprises. Jax moved with Lena through the fighter's cramped corridor, the air thick with the familiar scent of recycled oxygen, gun oil, and the faint metallic tang of overworked life support. Reyes met them in the bay, a stocky woman with a prosthetic arm that gleamed under the harsh lights. Her crew a mix of hardened faces, survivors all like them, with eyes that had seen too much void and too little mercy. "You two pulled off a miracle back there," she said, clapping Jax on the shoulder with a grip that spoke of respect. "Charges in the rings? Improvised as hell, but it worked like a charm. Bought us the time we needed to flank the main swarm." Thorn grunted from the doorway, hauling a crate of their salvaged gear across the threshold. "Time we almost didn't have. Toxin vents from their boarding pods nearly cooked us from the inside out before we could react." Reyes's expression darkened, a shadow crossing her features as she nodded in understanding. "Heard about those. Neural dissectors, they call them in the briefings. Meant to map our fight-or-flight responses, turn our own instincts against us like a weapon. But humans don't map clean or predictable. We adapt, we endure, throw their algorithms into chaos." Alarms blared suddenly through the fighter, the ship lurching as xenosignatures bloomed on the tactical display. Dozens of them, swarming out from the gas giant's shadow like a hive roused to anger. The aliens had analyzed their escape patterns, predicted the vector with chilling accuracy. Drones detached from larger vessels, sleek hunters closing in like a pack of wolves scenting blood. "Strap in, all of you," Reyes barked, dropping into the pilot's seat with practiced efficiency. "We've got the gear to make 'em regret waking up today." Jax settled beside Lena, the fighter's engines igniting with a thunderous surge that pressed them back into their seats. The viewport filled with the glittering chaos of the rings, debris still sparkling from their earlier blast like distant stars. As the formation accelerated into the fray, Reyes triggered the countermeasures, flares and chaff erupting in a deceptive cloud that masked their true path, buying moments in the deadly dance. But the Xenos adapted too, their lead ship firing a precision lance that clipped Vanguard 2, sending it into an uncontrolled spin with a trail of venting atmosphere. Static filled the comms. A crewman's shout cut short in a burst of noise. "Lost them," Thorn muttered from his seat, fists clenched white on the armrests. "Not yet," Jack said, his mind racing despite the toxin's haze, ideas snapping into place like puzzle pieces. "Reyes, those rings, can we use the debris wake? Draw them into a slingshot maneuver around the larger fragments." She glanced back over her shoulder, a fierce grin splitting her face amid the red alerts. "Risky as hell, but yes, plotting it now. Hold tight. This is gonna get bumpy." The maneuver was brutal and unforgiving. They dove low, skimming the edge of the ring's densest section, engines straining against the gravitational pull that tugged like invisible hands. The xenodrones pursued relentlessly, their sensors locked on, But the fighters wove through the clusters, massive ice boulders and jagged metal shards turning the chase into a deadly gauntlet, where one miscalculation meant obliteration. Jax monitored from the tack station, calling out adjustments in a steady voice. Port 15 degrees, there's a gap through that boulder field. One drone overshot its mark, smashing into a fragment with a silent bloom of wreckage that expanded like a flower in the vacuum. Another fired wildly, its beam carving a furrow through the rings but missing the agile fighters by meters. Lena handled point defense from her console. Her rifle swapped for controls that spat counter-missiles and rapid salvos, each hit chipping away at the swarm's cohesion. The lead Xeno cruiser loomed ahead, its bays yawning open to unleash a fresh wave of hunters into the fray. Reyes pushed the throttle to redline, the ship bucking under the G-forces. Now or never, initiating slingshot. Gravity whipped them around a massive ring segment, velocity spiking dangerously as they slung around the curve. The Xenos, fully committed to the pursuit, followed too closely, their formation tight and aggressive. The ring's tidal forces tore at them mercilessly, hulls crumpling under the strain, engines failing in cascades of plasma that lit the void. The cruiser buckled first, its dissected data on human weaknesses proving no match for the raw, unyielding physics of the maneuver they'd ignored in their arrogance. Debris hailed against the viewport in a storm of impacts as they broke free, the stars shifting to the open void beyond the rings. The surviving Xenos scattered,